In our timeline, Fidel Castro asked for a $10 bill from FDR when he was a child. In this alternate timeline, we'll assume that Castro gets his cash from FDR and his perception of the United States changes for the rest of his life. After the 1959 revolution, Castro and the Second National Front of Escambray takes power following the overthrow of Batista. Castro and the Second National Front of Escambray were viewed as freedom fighters in the U.S. and given aid and lots of good press. In this alternate timeline, Castro is pro-U.S. and renegotiates the sugar trade in post-Batista Cuba. The communists in the Cuban Revolution opposed this, but Castro and the Second National Front successfully control most of the Cuban government, and the communists wage a low-level insurgency that dies out. The U.S. aids rebels against dictators and communist regimes, while the USSR aids pro-Soviet rebels in the Third World. That's not necessarily anything new for the Cold War, but the difference here is that Castro and the Cubans are supporting rebels against communist regimes. This is big because Cuba and Castro in our timeline were major players in sparking uprisings and advising rebels in Africa and Latin America against Western-backed dictatorships. They also had a huge propaganda boost from the Soviets. But in this alternate timeline, all of that good press and extra rebellions are for NATO and the West instead of against them. One obvious change there would be in this alternate timeline is that there is no Bay of Pigs invasion without Cuba becoming communist, and there is also no Cuban Missile Crisis. This means that there's no quarantine of Cuba, and the state develops better by being open to the world and receiving American aid. Another change is that it's possible that JFK might live, but his assassination is not something that I want to get into in this video. We'll assume that the 1964 election is between JFK and Goldwater, assuming that Kennedy lives, and I'm pretty sure that Kennedy would win in this election. This results in the U.S. leaving Vietnam much sooner, possibly after the 1965 Battle of La Drang, although Kennedy was ready to pull out in 1963. Conservatives in U.S. politics would use the fall of South Vietnam to the north around 1968 to gain power, and Nixon wins in the 1968 election, defeating Lyndon B. Johnson. I think that Nixon might send some forces to Vietnam to help stabilize the South after the Tet Offensive, as this Vietnam War is completely different, as the American public views the pullout under Kennedy as the cause of the Tet Offensive. Nixon would also win in 1972 and combats poverty, opens trade with China, and increases defensive measures for states that have a treaty with the United States. There is probably no Watergate scandal due to Nixon's mainstream popularity and the lack of the Vietnam War's unpopularity until after this election. However, it's possible that Castro and Cuban advisors would go to Vietnam to fight for the South in support of anti-communist rebels in the North to prolong the war and create an insurgency for the North Vietnamese to have to deal with. This alternate Vietnam War could probably still end in 1975, but with a peace agreement between the two and keeping them divided. Kind of like the Paris Peace Accord, but without the Easter Offensive, and North Vietnam isn't emboldened to invade the South. But North Vietnam would still get a lot of land out of the war with the South. Global impacts of a communist Cuba in our timeline meant that there would be more communist-backed coups and rebellions in Africa and Latin America, something that I had mentioned before. But in this timeline, Africa and Latin America are more stable in Western and NATO-backed states without these rebellions, having Castro as their role model. Instead, anti-authoritarian rebels see the U.S. as a viable alternative, as well as alternate Cuba as their ideal models instead of the Soviet Union like they had done in our timeline. The story of Castro and the rebels overthrowing Batista was a massive move on the world stage to people in the third world countries who were on the fence about joining the capitalists or communists in the Cold War. I couldn't accurately predict the impacts of a capitalist Castro and Cuba leading rebellions across Africa and Latin America, which groups they would likely support if they're successful, and what happens on each scenario would have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and it would be very difficult to predict how all of these alternate rebellions would go in this video. One thing that I could sort of predict, however, is depending on how the Vietnam War goes, the Reagan era would have the U.S. involved in Nicaragua during the Contra-Sandinista War in the 1980s in some way, shape, or form. How this war goes, the level of involvement, and the public perception of this war are beyond the scope of this video, and that's where I'll leave this scenario. But that's just one possible scenario for if Cuba stayed a NATO ally after the 1959 Cuban Revolution. What do you think would have happened had Castro not been a communist and the Second National Front of Escambray seized power? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.